Thanks again, Jimena, Angie, Manuel, Alejandro. We're going to start today giving thanks to the folks that really helped make all of this possible. So today I'd like to really start by thanking Electronic Arts and Kabam and Activision Blizzard, Capcom, Coalition, all of these big gaming companies for providing all of the raw data and the model behind how they make their livings. What I'm going to start with is just trying to get us to understand that if we really believe in how developers make their money from games, if we understand the business of games and the benefits to all developers, especially indie developers, we're going to have a better time in game development. You see, studios have big budgets. Funding is not a problem for big studios. Problems they have are choosing which games to publish. Big studios are driven by public shareholder value. They're public companies. They have shares, they have stock. And if that stock doesn't go up in value every quarter, they're in real trouble. So they have to make safe bets on what games they do. Indie devs are free of those constraints. They don't have to grow their value or their stock price. They don't have any responsibility profit they have to take care of. What they have to do is be creative and innovative. They're passionate about what they're doing, and they need to make enough money to make the next great game. They're the ones that typically bring new IPs to market for us. But they all adhere to the same business principles. I know about this. My name's Scott Henshaw, and after 20 odd years in games, building teams and products that have delivered PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, and Xbox 360 launch titles, after winning multiple Spike Video Game Awards and over 7 Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences awards, my teams have built 8 new intellectual properties over the years. And part of that is understanding how today's games are a business first and entertainment second. That's what's critical to success. So let's take a look at what the economics and the business behind games really looks like. To understand that business behind games, the publishing and funding model we need to have a basic knowledge of. We need to know how game projects get started, what's the process by which they get built, only from the perspective that we're going to have to figure out what they cost to make. And the process goes kind of like this. Now, games are kind of software projects that really are designed to do one thing. They deliver an experience to players. We try and deliver something that gives you an emotional reaction. We try and make sure that players feel something as they play our games. And that starts with a concept. Someone dreams up a crazy idea, and they wrap it up in a design, and they try and make at least 20% of it somehow unique. Then we test that concept in the market. Before we ever build it, we want to take a look at, do we think this thing is going to have a reasonable financial success? How do we do that? We start by looking at comparables. We take a look at the game design that we have on paper, and we go try and find a bunch of similar projects. We try and use those similar projects to figure out how many people might play our game. We then choose a revenue model to try and figure out how we're going to monetize our game. We take a look at the development costs of our game. We try and subtract a wild guess at our expenses. And we take a look at the amount of revenue we'd make, subtracting the expenses that it might cost to make it, and we try and decide if the game is worth doing. If we think we're going to make a profit, we will probably go forward and start producing our game. Now again, if it's a large studio project, funding isn't a problem and we can get right into building. If it's a small indie title, there's one more step along the way, and that is figuring out how you're going to get that game funded. How are you going to get people to work on your project? Let's take a look at how you can figure out what it's going to cost to start with. And that stems from knowing how we make games. We can build anything, but we need to know what the process is for building a game before we can forecast how much it's going to cost. We take a look at our comparables and we take a look at how many units or how many players they have, and we get a rough idea of what we're going to revenue-wise generate from this project. We then take a look at our development process and we figure out how many people is it going to take. We compare these two numbers, we do some math, and then hopefully we're making a profit. We get all excited about it and we start to plan the details of our project. And that might get us depressed a little bit from time to time because the development costs might be really large. What we have to do is figure out from a business perspective, how do we forecast our project? How do we choose the right business model? And how do we minimize the expenses or the costs it takes to create this project? Just because you know how you're going to build your game doesn't mean you actually do it. We have to figure out whether or not it's going to cost too much to make versus what we think we're going to earn from it. How much time and money is really a project management problem. And I'm not going to get into the gory details behind how we plan a development project. What I will tell you is this: when we're thinking about the expenses behind a project, we know we can build the game, and that's kind of the hard part. What we don't really always take account of is that some of the key things about how much it's going to cost have to do with people. Now here, we kind of budget things, and a lot of people will try and tell us, oh, well, I'll help you with your game development. I'll help you get the computers you need. Well, the first thing to recognize is one key point. The actual hardware we make games with, the actual computers, no matter how expensive they might seem, typically account for between 3 and 5% of the total budget of a project. The rest of it, almost exclusively, goes to salaries. Now, in our area here in Vancouver, we have a lot of game companies, and these game companies do share with us the kind of salaries they pay, depending on whether you're an artist or a programmer or whether you have some seniority or not. The typical game developer salary lies somewhere between $50,000 and $80,000 a year. That means if you need 5 people on your team, you have to budget for between $250,000 and a couple $1 million to build your project. It means when you're forecasting your project, you better have enough people lined up to play your game that you can earn that much in a year. Now, when we talk about acquiring developers, everybody thinks they can pull people in cheap and easy. When we're doing this as a business, we have to assume that to get quality developers, we're going to need to be able to lure them away from where they are or hire them out of school and give them some sense of security. So from an expense perspective, we kind of want to have a year's worth of funding available to build our game. Now, this is the boring part, or the depressing part, is trying to figure out how much money is really going to take to build your game. On top of building your game, we're going to have to do some other tasks with it, and they're going to cost us some money too. Those tasks we do have to do with planning, they have to do with funding, they have to do with marketing. We got good plans, good marketing, good development team, quality product. It's not going to be free. We're going to have to invest in order to get that. And the investment turns around into how well will we rate our game. What most studios and indie developers do when they forecast their games is they try and figure out how many people will play by finding related titles and finding how many they sold or how many players they have. Part of that comparison is about going and looking at critics and critic reviews of games. If you have a game team and you think you can do the next best, greatest shooter game, then you probably need to go look at all of the other shooter games. You need to look at Call of Duty and Battlefield. You need to look at some of the, MOBA games, or rather some of the Battle Royale games, to see what kind of Metacritic ratings they have. And yeah, we do use the Metacritic.com site to give us a global view of that. If I'm doing Call of Duty and I'm getting an 80 Metacritic, and I want to compete with Call of Duty, I'm going to come up with a new game, and I'm going to have to at least get to their quality level before I can claim to get anywhere near the number of players they're going to have. So that inexact art of forecasting how much or how many people are going to get into our game is directly related to how we're going to position our game in the market and what kind of quality we can build. That's related to the team that you put together. The better the team with the better reputation is going to be able to more easily convince people that they're going to build a higher Metacritic quality game. And if they can build a higher Metacritic quality game, they can probably justify a higher forecast. Now, when it comes down to figuring out whether or not the project should happen or not, that's the place where studios and indies both kind of work on the same premise. You put together a forecast, you project your revenue, and then you subtract away your expenses. And if there's a profit at the end, you probably should go ahead and do it. And if there isn't, you'll be happy you didn't invest a ton of money trying to build a project. Now, one of the biggest advantages I said at the beginning was that studios have a huge funding advantage. And that's because they have a track record of games that have delivered on time and generated revenue. So they typically have surplus funds or profits from a previous title to help them fund the next title. Indie studios have a bigger challenge with this. And eventually I'll get to talking about how they get their funding in place. Now, that's the depressing part. The fun part is you got this great idea, and now you want to figure out, how much can I make? Can I make enough money to build the next title? Can I make enough money to cover what it costs to make? Can I make enough money to be rich? And here's where predicting our forecast really comes into its own. Once we have an idea of how many players we think we can get into our game, we need to figure out a revenue model. And there's a few we're going to talk about. Once we get our revenue model, we'll be able to do some math, and we'll be able to figure out what kind of revenue we think we're going to generate lifetime for our project. And here's another place where studios differ from indie developers. Studios don't take risks. Studios are designed so that they are trying to improve their stock price. They're about predictability. They're about making sure that the next sequel that comes along is at least as good as the previous one, so they can collect the same number of players into the title. That gives them the ability to figure out how much they're going to earn. And when you add up across all of the titles they do, those earnings get to use to get funding the next year's games. It's a cycle. Indie developers, on the other hand, have a different approach. Indie developers are about taking risks. Indie developers are about rolling the dice and seeing if you're going to be the next lottery winner. But at the same time, if you understand the business model and you're an indie developer, you will be smart enough to not start down the path of building a title that will never make money. So when we talk about these things, we talk about studios and their predictability, and we talk about indies and innovation and creativity. For all of these projects, in the very typical business sense, you kind of have two different levers you can play with. Now, there are three things we can deal with. We can deal with quality, time, or the features in your game. And the challenge is you can only adjust 2 of those. In a studio sense, you typically have a studio that will deal with quality and time, and they will adjust features to make sure they ship on a specific day. That gives them predictability. For an indie dev, you might forego time and you might say it's not ready until this set of features at this level of quality is ready to go. Where studios generally work with indies is when they want to acquire new technologies or new products. So you got your great game. You got a rough idea of how much you think you can earn. You've got an idea of how much is it going to cost to make. And when you take a look at the 2 of them together, you realize there's a good chance you're going to make some money with this. So where do you go next? Where you go next is to talk to a publisher. Now, the publishers are about getting out into the marketplace. And the how and who of publishing is really all about knowing your target audience. You want to have your players meet your forecasted expectations. So you need to know where to find them. Finding your players is about identifying which platforms they're going to be on, which regions they're going to live in, which demographics, how many languages are you going to support. We need to find publishing platforms that support the market we want to go to. So we can take a look at, say, today's market and look at exactly where are players. You can see from this chart, the dark blue on the side is the mobile market. The green is our PC market. And the cyan on the bottom right is our console game market. Now it's interesting that studios still focus mostly on the console market. And to a second extent, they focus on the mobile market. Publishers kind of own these platforms. When we talk about consoles, we're talking about Sony, Microsoft, Nintendo. When we're talking about mobile, we're talking about Android and iOS. And they all kind of follow the same model. And that is, you produce a game, and if you have a good enough reputation, you can finish the game and submit it to a publisher. They will look at your game. They will evaluate your game against their guidelines or criteria and decide whether or not to publish your game on their platform. Now, for a developer who's got a big track record and a really good reputation, if you looked at somebody like Electronic Arts or you looked at somebody like Capcom, you would find that they don't need to go ahead of time and talk to these console manufacturers. All they have to do is say, we have a new FIFA coming, or we have a new Dead Rising coming. And once they do that, the console manufacturers make room for them. They are predictable, they know when they're going to arrive, and they will make sure that they try and fit them into the schedule. Now, part of this is because the way the business works here is that the console manufacturers take a percentage of every unit that's sold. That typical percentage is 30% of everything. Now, when we get to the PC market, there's really one big player when it comes to the PC. And major studios don't really go so deep into the PC because they don't see it as a big, lucrative market. That one publisher is Steam. And Steam has roughly 75% of all PC game sales. Choosing which platforms to go after, which publisher you want to talk to, is going to dictate which audience you're going after. Now, I said that publishers typically take about 30% of your gross sales off the top. There are a couple exceptions to this. The first one is Epic Games, the people who make Unreal. They're bucking this trend by only charging a 22% royalty. In addition, there's a couple small PC publishers that are out there that are trying to get into the marketplace. I think one of the most innovative ones I've come across is a publisher called itch.io. They're entirely online. You submit everything online. And their entire pricing model is pay what you think the game is worth. Even with that, these guys still make money. We also have to figure out when we're going to launch our title and how many regions or languages we're going to launch it into. If you combine these things, you get a broad spectrum that you're going to shoot at for where your game goes. If you figure out that your PlayStation, Xbox game is probably going to land in 4 or 5 different common languages, the languages we refer to as the EFIGS languages, or English, French, Italian, Spanish, and German, which covers the largest portion of the gaming population in the world. That means if you do just 2 platforms and 5 languages, you have to make your game 10 times. Or you have to be smart about how you make it. This also helps you bring a bigger forecast in. The more platforms, the more languages, the bigger your forecast. Now, it also helps to know who plays what kind of games. Not everybody's going to play your game. So let's take a look at some of the places our game development has evolved. Now, this is kind of an interesting chart I found about what platforms people have kind of gravitated to. Early on, the arcade, where we put coins in the machine, was the biggest generator of revenue when it comes to games. The bottom cyan band is the console market, and that console market has largely stayed the same. Every evolution of the console gives us a new group of players, but it's largely the same players over and over again. The PC market similarly has stayed pretty much stagnant. It's the same size market. It has a challenge in that PC gaming machines are typically a lot more expensive than a game console, so you reach a smaller audience. The biggest market you can see is in red here, and that is the mobile market. And the mobile market is really taken off, mostly I think because everybody has a mobile device. The other things we have to recognize when we start looking at this forecast and how do we get our players is that most game studios do not target kids. Kids are not our target audience. Our target audience is typically 20 to 30-year-olds. I mean, let's think about it. If we're trying to target kids, kids don't really have a lot of disposable income, and certainly not easy to access credit cards. On the other hand, 20 to 30-year-olds, particularly those who are in trades or have just finished their schooling, have time and money. They usually have jobs. They usually have relatively few commitments. At this point of their life, they don't typically have a mortgage to pay, car payments to pay, or the biggest expense of all, some significant other that they're spending their time with. So these are the people we target when we're playing with a game audience. We also recognize that we have kind of 2 main audiences we go after. We have hardcore gamers and casual gamers. And the definitions we use for them are pretty surprising to most. Hardcore games are people who play 1 or 2 sessions a week, and typically they'll play at least 4 hours in a session. That's up to 8 hours a week. Casual gamers typically only play about half hour at a time. But we've seen that casual gamers typically play anywhere from 12 to 15 hours a week. It should also be noted that female players make up over 50% of the casual market. And they're just under 50% of the hardcore market. Yet most devs still focused on the 20 to 30-year-olds to make their demographics up. Now, indie devs have an opportunity here because they're not tied to predictability. They have an opportunity to create and innovate in areas that go into new markets and get new players who otherwise may not want to play the next best Call of Duty shooter game. Indie devs are free to experiment. In addition, we can also look at who plays games. Right? If we look at the age group, the statistics prove out what I'm saying. When we look at the 16 to 22-year-olds, they're not as predominant in terms of the people we target games to as, say, the 23 to 30-year-olds. These kind of demographics can be used by you to figure out what kind of features go in your game. You also see here gaming by region, and you'll take a very close look at which region is the most heavily influenced by gaming right now. Surprisingly, you guys are all in the middle of it. So the next big step really is going to be figuring out how many games we can get out of this region. What's going to appeal to the local market? The other thing I've kind of skimmed over at this part is, while we have a forecast and we can probably come up with a list of expenses for our project, I've glossed over kind of the business model behind how games monetize. So let's take a look at that. When we start thinking about your business model, it kind of distills down into 4 basic versions that we see. The 4 main business models we see day in, day out are what we call packaged goods, subscriptions, paywalls, and free-to-play. And of those, 2 of them kind of rule everything. Now, in quick summary here, the packaged good model also covers what we call digital download. And this basically says that the developer is going to make the product, and once they finish it, they're going to wrap it up in a bundle, and you pay your money and you get the thing. It's a one and done. And the upsides are it's very predictable. Typically, our packaged goods model is the kind of model that most big studios want to follow, again, for predictability reasons. Once you pay for a product, you get it now and forever. You can do whatever you want with it. If you're buying a disc and you want to spend $70 on buying the next Dragon's Age, you go right ahead and do that. And if you decide you want to destroy that disc right away without ever playing it, the studio doesn't care. They've already got your money. The second model here is a subscription model. And the subscription model has kind of come and is kind of dying out again. It's where you pay every month for access to online content that's constantly updating and changing. And I think most of why the subscription model has died away is because there's better models out there, and the subscription model leaves people feeling like they have to play a little bit every month to keep up with what they're paying for it. The third one I have on here is called a paywall. And this is where a portion of that game or that project is free, and you get to play it until you get hooked. And then, in order to progress beyond a certain point, you make a one-time fee for access. Once you pay your fee, you then get access to all of the content. The final one is free-to-play, and it's been much maligned over the years. It was a model that started predominantly in Asia to avoid pirates, really. The idea is almost all of the information about you and all of the information about your game playing experience is tracked on a central server. The client, or the game you actually play, connects to that server and downloads almost all of the information that's customized to you. Your progress, your stats, your information, items you have, everything. It then tries to monetize that. So when we look at how those monetize, we can kind of come up with a basic set of formulas for them. The first one, for packaged goods, the simple formula is we just multiply our forecast times the number of unit, or the unit price for each one. If I'm selling them at $50 a piece and I forecast 1 million units, that's $50 million of revenue. Let's not forget that unit price needs to be big enough that we can afford to give up 30% of it to our publisher. Subscription fees work the same way. You take the forecast of the number of players and you multiply by the subscription fee. Don't forget to take that subscription fee and reduce it by 30% for what you have to pay the publisher. Subscriptions typically are done monthly. So to get an annual revenue, we would just multiply that by 12. Paywalls and free-to-play, things get a little more complicated. Mathematically speaking, at a really high level, you're going to compute a couple fancy numbers. One of the ones you're going to compute is a percentage of paying users. Not everybody is going to go through your paywall. Typically, what we see statistically is that about 5% of your audience will actually pay to go further in a paywall-oriented game. 5%. That gives us roughly 50,000 people in a million. So when we look at that, we're thinking about, okay, we take our price per unit, we subtract the 30% we pay to the publisher, and we multiply that by a percentage of our forecast. Free-to-play combines that with another value. And the other value we combine it with is the average revenue per paying user. You see, in a free-to-play game, we're funded by microtransactions. And the theory behind microtransactions is they're small. They're so small that nobody really cares. They're so tiny, they're insignificant. 10 cents for this, 50 cents for that, $1 for that. Keep it small. Well, it turns out the average revenue per paying user, typically in North America, is $22 per month per paying user. And like paywalls, they run a similar percentage of paying users. So roughly 5%. The math gets a little bit more complicated, right? You take the now forecasted number of monthly average users, you figure out a smaller size of that based on the percentage that actually pay, and you multiply by your average revenue per paying user. If you're lucky, on top of that, you'll add some advertising revenue. But keep in mind, the advertising revenue is not as big as you think it's going to be. Advertising revenue is typically based on how many clicks people make to get to an ad or how many impressions they see of an ad. And it's typically metered out in terms of pennies per thousands of impressions. So basing your entire revenue on advertising revenue is probably not a smart bet. You can combine these things, and quite often projects do. The biggest way we get a larger revenue stream is we expand the number of platforms and the number of languages we do. But that costs money. If we're doing an Android game, we're going to write it in Kotlin, which is Android's programming language. If we're doing an iOS game, we're going to write it in Swift. If we want to be on both platforms, we have to effectively write the game twice. If we want to do an Xbox or a PlayStation, one of them is developed on a PC and one of them is developed largely on a Linux box. So we have to take into account that we're going to have to cross-compile our project. When we look at the Nintendo Switch, we've got a different platform again. Every different platform costs us a little bit of money. So we're going to take a look at how those models for how you generate revenue affect your game design. Of the four major models that I've listed before, there's really two of them that kind of dominate the revenue streams today. And they're the packaged goods model that you see for all major studios on console games and Steam PC games, and the free-to-play model, where you download a client for free, it gets updated automatically, and you use microtransactions to purchase add-ons for your game. Done well, free-to-play games create some sort of balance between what players earn and what players pay for. Done poorly, they can generate pay-to-win scenarios. Although I do tend to mention that one case study showed that a game called Clash of Clans, if you were to pay to win and buy everything there, would cost you $75,000 US to buy everything. So for the most part, the pay to win is kind of a fallacy that's been built up by some media. Now, digital download or expansion packs, those are just variations on the packaged goods model. Here's the challenge with packaged goods. While it's predictable in terms of knowing how much you will make, meeting your forecast typically is the biggest challenge. You can forecast 1 million players or 10 million players, but getting those players is the hard part. What's more, what we've seen historically is that packaged goods products make 90% of their lifetime revenue in week one. And we can predict their lifetime revenue by their day one, week one sell-through, or how much they sell on the first day they're launched. Most of these packaged goods products make as much as 70% of their entire lifetime earnings in that one day. If you spend a year building a project for a major studio, whether or not you succeed or not and make your forecast and earn a profit is typically dictated by the one first day of sales in week one when you launch it. That's a lot of pressure in studios. On the other hand, free-to-play microtransaction games are exactly the opposite. They typically don't make any money in their first day or their first week or sometimes their first few months. It takes a while to build an audience in a free-to-play game, an audience that gets deep enough into your game to see the benefits of buying these microtransaction items, how they might project how you play through the game or accelerate getting from one part to another in the game. And you can figure out how you're going to do by taking a look at how these games monetize. Now, there's some case studies we can talk about later, but it's easier to just look at a couple charts. Now, this is a couple years old, but I looked at the 2018 game revenue, and this is for packaged goods premium games. You'll notice in the chart here that we're talking about millions of dollars. So $429 million for Overwatch. We're seeing that some of the really big games are done by what you'd think of as big AAA studios. And they range from about $500 million to $1 billion. And if it's so successful, why change? Which is why big studios don't change too much. In comparison, the free-to-play game earnings in the same year looked like this. These charts are on the same scale. You should notice that the revenues from 900 million to almost 2.5 billion. That the number 10 free-to-play game from 2018 made more money than the top 9 packaged goods games. The big observation here, you don't see any of those big AAA publishers. They're rare. Knowing the business and knowing where your audience is can lead you to these kinds of numbers. They're open to anybody. You have to do a little digging to find the raw information. Where you publish your game is also a pretty challenging proposition. Now, studios typically self-publish. They partner with platforms like Microsoft and Sony and Nintendo, and they typically reserve a launch window. Sometimes they have to pay a deposit of up to $1 million. And only the people with the best track record get to pick their time when they want to publish. One of the biggest sales times is US Thanksgiving weekend. If you want to have your game on store shelves before the US Thanksgiving weekend, you need to negotiate to find out when you can have it published. Indie devs typically have a much harder time partnering with a studio to publish. Often, they have to get a hold of a studio and find a publishing partner just to get through to a console. If they're publishing on the PC, they have a little bit easier time. Likewise, if they can partner with a major studio, the studio may advance them funding that pays the team to deliver a game. The studio would also help in that case with first-party approval and with some marketing funding. In exchange, the indie dev would agree to give up all of their revenue until the advance is paid back. And then they would do a royalty deal where each party, the studio and the indie developer, would get a percentage of what they propose to make. Now, publishing markets have generated new indie areas to deal with some of this. Sony, Microsoft have indie markets that allow new talent to publish games without as much process or preparation. They keep them separate from the big AAA studio games so that they can list out why they're giving them preferential treatment in certain cases. If you have a good demo and you can get to a publisher to convince them, you might be able to get your game published to a console this way. Nintendo actually licenses a Switch with a custom version of Unity that can generate Switch titles. And that whole kit runs roughly around $750. It's accessible. Because of COVID, we have a huge growth in the PC market, and that means Steam. And Steam has a publishing outlet that you can contact them and deliver your game digitally to Steam for approval. PC games studios long ago relegated to alternative platforms. It was a smaller bastard child that they didn't want to support, are opening up as PCs become more and more capable. Online publishers are also providing more accessible portals than ever before. Digital distribution means almost anybody can self-publish if you know where to go and how to access them. And that gets us to our indies. I've talked a lot about them because I think COVID has created a much larger audience for gaming, and I think it's leveled the playing field where an indie developer has some of the best opportunities ever. I mean, let's take a look. Modern game engines are kind of a game changer. Unity and Unreal provide the ability for an indie developer to develop a quality look and a quality functional game for a fraction of the cost of what it would cost a major studio to do. These game engines are largely free. Maybe you have to buy 1 or 2 pro licenses, but that's still only in the neighborhood of $1,500 US. Less than 1 dev PC is the cost of getting a professional license for these game engines. Many of the studios, in an opposite sense, have tied themselves to legacy game engines or to no game engine at all. It's widely known that Electronic Arts uses a game engine called Frostbite that they built for themselves. No one's ever seen it. It's proprietary. Coalition uses Unreal, but they use a highly customized variant all their own. So while the studio games might get a little bit more visual quality out of their game engines, the difference is often very small. Studio teams' advantage in visual fidelity is currently at an all-time low. The other advantages that indies have these days: a global workforce. I mean, COVID has proven to all of us that it doesn't matter where you are in the world, you can work. It's not just the biggest companies anymore that can relocate people and pay them huge salaries. Think about it. You don't need a work visa. You don't need to relocate. You don't need any of those hassles. You just need to find the best people and take advantage of the fact that you can put them all electronically and virtually in the same place at the same time. For the last year and a bit, all of our Vancouver Film School projects have been collaborating online. All of our team members working remotely. And yet we haven't slowed down in the number of games we produce. Every 4 months, another batch of 6 or 8 games comes out of Vancouver Film School, all remote. We made the shift. We managed to figure out how to make it work. We handled the communication, and we just kept pushing forward. So while there are still challenges, most of the challenges aren't with finding that workforce. For the indie, the biggest challenges are funding. Where do you get money from to pay your team? The second biggest challenge is often marketing. How do you get the biggest amount of marketing bang for your buck? And how do you find the dollars to do that? And finally, talent. Because you can compete on a global scale as an indie, it also means the studios can too. So if you're going to compete with a big studio, you probably need some innovative thing that seems too risky for them, but which you've done the work behind the scenes to make sure that you think it's going to be profitable. And hopefully at this point, you're starting to believe that understanding the business of games benefits all game developers. That if you understand how you make games and what it costs to make games and what you might earn from making games, you can choose which games to build before you even start constructing them by choosing the games that are going to be profitable enough to support their own development. Thank you very much.
Wow. You never know how much is behind a video game, right? I mean, just take it from someone that's not from the industry, but it's so much stuff going on when like when you're playing a video game. You can imagine how many situations, how long is the process that you're taking. So
Right.
that was an amazing explanation for